Hello there, my name is Matthew Gorley, and I am currently going over a summary and a synopsis. This won't be a full reading of the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Now, full disclaimer, I am not a student of political science. As a matter of fact, I'm a student of psychology, and I'm actually more curious about why this ideology is coming back with such fervor in today's youth despite its failed and extraordinarily bloody past, and I figured this was a really good place to start. Now, the first place I have to begin is really noting that amongst my studies, we have to realize that we cannot truly understand communism or communist ideology from this book alone. Karl Marx was a prolific writer on the topic, and I would encourage you guys to study a variety of resources in regards to communist ideologies before forming an opinion on this. What this is, however, is an attempt to help us better understand this little pamphlet that ended up so revolutionizing the world so many years ago and continues to capture the imagination of so many youth today. So let's dive right into it. Once again, the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. The summary of the book, really, if you're just here for a summary, this is a good place to start and finish. Consider this your Coles Notes or Sparks Notes version of this book. But the first reality of the book is that it is an attempt to explain the goals of the communist movement. It argues that class struggles are the motivating forces behind all of history, and that the march of history is driven by economic forces. Ultimately, historically, there has always been a ruling class and an exploited class. These classes today, or at the very least at the time of this writing, could have been divided into two categories: the bourgeoisie, the ruling class behind the profit machine, and the proletariat, which was the working class. That is the class that was being exploited by the ruling class. What occurs is a natural cycle of dissatisfaction in the exploited class. Ultimately, the exploited class rises up and overthrows the ruling class. And what Marx and Engels argue is that inevitably the only thing they end up accomplishing is forming a new ruling class. The manifesto argues that a revolution is necessary for a change towards a new government. This new government is focused on the representative nature that makes decisions for the proletariat's massed best interests. And ultimately, this would abolish private property, create heavy taxation, centralize credit to the government. All instruments of production in terms of factories would be given to the state, and there would be an equal liability for all labor amongst the population and free education. Ultimately, this would be for the dissolution of class systems formed by land ownership, national identity, politics, religions, and other instruments that press morality on the masses. Now, what's notable is that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were very, very clear that this was to only come about as a result of revolution, and revolution it did spark. Now, if you're anything like me and you want to know more about the literature itself and get a little bit of a deeper dive, the book itself is divided into four parts. The first part is the bourgeoisie and the proletarians. The second part, the proletarians and the communists. The third part, socialist and communist literature. And the fourth part, position of the communists in relation to the various existing parties. Now, the first part is, in fact, the longest part, so let's dive right into it. Now, the book starts out rather ominously, and it says, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism." It divides these two classes, the bourgeoisie, into the ruling class, or the class that is treated or created from the machine of capitalism, and the proletariat, which is the class created as a result of the workings of the bourgeoisie, the class that sells its labor to appeal to the desires of the bourgeoisie. Now, the bourgeoisie is actually sprouted from class antagonism, according to Marx, from the feudal system. The bourgeoisie, however, has not eliminated class antagonism. It has only served to simplify it. So he's talking about it coming from a time when monarchs used to rule, and these monarchs created class antagonism that effectively suppressed this bourgeoisie class from being able to form the machine, the profit-driven machine that would ultimately go on to create and exploit the proletariat, the working class. The bourgeoisie is formed out of a series of modes of production and free exchange, and the political machine is formed entirely for the desires of the bourgeoisie class. Ultimately, the bourgeoisie is a class that turns personal worth into something of value to be exchanged, oftentimes through labor. Now, this is for exploitation, as it is veiled by political and religious illusions. The bourgeoisie, as is quoted in the text, the bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production and with them the whole relations of society. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. Ultimately, the bourgeoisie compels all nations on pain of extinction to adopt its institutions and calls this civilization. Basically, it creates a world after its own image. The bourgeoisie forms political parties for its interests and concentrates all property into a few individual hands. Ultimately, the bourgeoisie was built out of the failures of the feudal system regarding its ability to provide for the masses. Oftentimes, the bourgeoisie will go through the same issues and feel the need to meet the demands of its own production, and in the desire to meet the demands of its own production, its only solution is to more thoroughly exploit existing markets and or expand into new markets. As the bourgeoisie grows, it forms weapons of its own destruction, according to Marx. More notably, it forms a working class, which it exploits, and also creates a class that can wield the weapons of the bourgeoisie's own destruction. This working class is called the proletariat. As the bourgeoisie grows, so does capital. Capital is an instrument of the bourgeoisie, and in proportion to this capital growth, so does the working class. This working class lives only so long as they find work, and find work so long as their work only serves to increase capital. As a result, the working class becomes an appendage of the bourgeoisie machine. Notably, as the work's repulsiveness grows, the work's wages actually decrease. As time passes, man becomes a slave to the machines of the bourgeoisie. Conversely, the more accessible work becomes, the machine of the bourgeoisie also includes the production abilities of women and children. That is to say, the more efficient the work becomes, the more accessible the work becomes, the easier the work becomes. Eventually, the bourgeoisie starts swallowing up the family system as an instrument for its own purposes. This system is a system of exploitation, according to Marx and Engels, results in the exploitations for your labor. Eventually, once you've gained capital, which is created as a result of the bourgeoisie in the first place, you are then exploited by other sources such as the landlord, the shopkeeper, and the pawnbroker. Now, Marx and Engels divided the stages of the proletarian struggle into 9 steps. The first step is that initially, when we start seeing this tension arise between the bourgeoisie and the working class, the workers of the factory rebel, and this spreads to the workers of the trade within the municipality against the bourgeoisie that exploits them. That is to say, it expands. They rebel by smashing the machinery and setting factories on fire. The second stage is that if there's any remaining feudal monarchy, the proletariat are often so disorganized that the bourgeoisie unifies them for the purposes of the bourgeoisie to eliminate the feudal class of society that is currently oppressing the bourgeoisie. This is ultimately a victory for the bourgeoisie, and we have to keep in mind that this is written at a time when many countries, especially in Europe, were still very monarchist in nature, still very feudal in nature. So what they were saying was that as dissatisfaction grew amongst the proletariat, what would ultimately end up coming about is that this dissatisfaction would create these riots, and in this disorganization of these riots, the bourgeoisie would unify the proletariat to eliminate the feudal class entirely. Eventually, the proletariat grows in population, and machinery improves efficiency for the bourgeoisie. However, it ultimately lowers the wages of the proletariat. You see this a lot nowadays in terms of artificial intelligence, self-checkout aisles, and the ongoing growth and efficiency of technology. From here, the workers begin to form trade unions against the bourgeoisie to keep up the rates of wages, and sometimes when those needs go unmet, there are revolts. Now, these trade unions form in many municipalities, and eventually communication amongst the unions turns the entire municipality struggle into a national struggle, which is something that Marx and Engels admire. This national struggle results in political parties representing the needs of the working class. Interestingly enough, because the bourgeoisie conflicts with the bourgeoisie of other municipalities and countries, the bourgeoisie of the local country reaches out to the proletariat for political assistance to compete against the bourgeoisie of other countries. The bourgeoisie of the local municipality will actually educate the working class of the proletariat and form even more weapons against themselves for the proletariat to use against the existing bourgeoisie. So what the bourgeoisie does in order to form these unions against other bourgeoisie or other feudal systems is they will educate the working class, and the working class ends up becoming smart enough to fight the bourgeoisie. As dissatisfaction amongst the proletariat class increases, violence is about to break out. Just as revolution is about to occur, Marx and Engels say that notably a portion of the bourgeoisie joins the revolutionary class. This is the portion of the bourgeoisie who understood theoretically the history of this cycle. Now they go on in this section to describe that there are differences between the conservatives and the proletariat. You have to keep in mind that Marx and Engels are encouraging a revolution through a revolutionary class. Effectively, the proletariat is the revolutionary class, and there is a difference between conservatives and proletariats. The text quotes that the lower middle class, the small manufacturer, the shopkeeper, the artisan, the peasant, all of these fight against the bourgeoisie to save from extinction their existence as fractions of the middle class. That is, they fight against the bourgeoisie to maintain their lower middle class status. They're trying to roll back the wheels of time, but they aren't doing it for the purposes of completely eliminating the class system. They're only doing it as conservatives to maintain their existing standing as lower middle class citizens. Conservatives, in effect, try to maintain what they have, and they will only become a part of the revolutionary class, the proletariat, when the rise of the revolution has started. You have to keep in mind the proletariat is a class without property, a class that has nothing to lose but the chains of the bourgeoisie. They do not hold the same traditional values of the bourgeoisie or the conservatives. Owning nothing and not being able to own any means of production, the proletariat's eventually mission is to destroy all means of private property. The proletariat sinks lower and lower until it is determined that the bourgeoisie itself is unfit to rule. And keep in mind, with the growth of capitalism, what Marx and Engels is saying is there is a growth of the proletariat. With the more efficient machinery, the more efficient tools, the more efficient growth of capital, ultimately people get paid less and less, and this working class grows more and more, and they become increasingly dissatisfied and totally upheave the entire established order. So again, there are stages. The bourgeoisie forms capital. The condition for capital existing is wage labor. Wage labor exists exclusively on laborers competing with one another. Industry efficiency slowly replaces laborers. The evolutionary nature of industry undercuts the wage laborer. The foundations upon the wit bourgeoisie system rests. The proletariat becomes disenfranchised and with nothing to lose, destroys the rule and system of the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie creates their own weapons and supplies them to the forces that use the weapons against them. Basically, it is a self-defeating system. Let's go on to the next stage. Now looking at the second section of the Communist Manifesto, it's titled Proletarians the Communists. Now there is already a formation of working class parties all across Europe. The Communist Manifesto actually differentiates itself from other working class parties in one, that they believe that they bring the interests of all of the working classes' struggles together regardless of nationality, and two, while the working class struggles through the stages, the communists believe they represent the interests of the working class movement as a whole. Now, the immediate aim of the communist is the formation of the proletariat into a class, overthrowing the bourgeoisie, and the conquest of the political power of the proletariat. The most distinguishing feature of the Communist Party isn't so much the demolition of property in general, but the elimination of bourgeoisie property, the property that exploits the working class, such as landlord relationships, rents, etc. The theory of communism may be summed up in a single sentence, according to Marx and Engels, as the abolition of private property. Now, the abolition of properties, Marx and Engels believed that property, as it stood under the bourgeoisie, was based on an antagonistic relationship between capital and wage labor. Capital was the idea that was formed by a capitalist. You had personal interests and social interests in the production of capital and money. Now, this is really important that we recognize personal interests and social interests. It was argued that capital was actually a collective product, a product created by many individuals through the united actions of those members, and only by this united action can capital actually be set in motion. So you see where Marx and Engels are really going with this, where they say that no. The money created from industry is a collective product, and it realistically should be treated as such. Capital is therefore not a personal power. It is in fact a social power created through social actions. Now, dividing that up, you see wage labor as well, and the average price of wage labor was considered the minimum wage and still largely is considered the minimum wage. And this is the wage that is required in order to keep a laborer in a state of bare existence. Marx and Engels argued that they did not want to do away with this form of labor, a type of labor that allowed somebody to simply live. What they argued was that they wanted to abolish the exploitation of labor to increase capital. Now, to capitalist thinking, you have to realize that the minimum wage is something that a capitalist can get away with paying you. Instead of what Marx and Engels argued was that we needed a minimum living standard for all people, and this was oftentimes viewed as better under communist ideology. In a bourgeoisie society, living labor was a means by which to acquire more labor. The capital was earned and then used as an instrument to enrich the capitalist. In a communist society, however, accumulated labor is a means by which we improve the living standard of the laborer. In a bourgeoisie, quoting Marx and Engels, in a bourgeoisie society, capital is independent and has individuality, while unfortunately the living person is dependent and has no individuality. Now, there were some objections to communism in the time of Marx and Engels. The first objection, and they still exist even today when you talk to people about communism in particular that aren't really educated in the case, is that the horrors, there would be horror in doing away with private property. That was the first objection. Marx and Engels argued that in a bourgeoisie society, private property was already done away with for 9/10 of the population. Marx and Engels argued that 1/10 of the population owning 9/10 of the property was precisely the problem that needed to be done away with. The second objection was that under communism, individuality would vanish. Individual actually only seemed to apply to the bourgeoisie. The exploitation of labor was so severe, as Marx and Engels criticized, that individuality was robbed of the proletariat through the creation and use for the exploitation of capital. And this came in the form of rents, capital, money, which was capable of being monetized. It's argued that capitalism deprives no man of the means to acquire the products of a collective society. It does, however, deprive him of the means to subjugate the labor of others. And I should note that should say that communism deprives no man of the means to acquire the products of a collective society. It does, however, deprive him of the means to subject the labor of others. The third objection was not being able to own private property, was only to serve to spread universal labor, laziness. Now, Marx and Engels argued that if this was actually true, then the proletariat, those of whom currently under the bourgeoisie society could not own anything, would have simply drafted themselves into complete laziness, and the bourgeoisie system would have fallen apart. And this is evidently not the case. And the fourth objection was that there would be a loss of freedom under communism. Marx and Engels argue that the only freedom experienced under the bourgeoisie is only sold as freedom in order to train a man to become a slave to the machine of capital. The only culture a man experiences under the bourgeoisie and capitalist movement is the culture that makes him part of the machine. Now, going forward, Marx and Engels also proposed the dissolution of the families. They argued that the dissolution of the family was actually going to be a consequence of the communist state. They saw the family as a bourgeoisie unit dedicated to the division of labor between the sexes and the source of private property through inheritance, something Marx and Engels equated to exploitation. More notably, during the time of the writing, Marx and Engels argued that the family was dissolved under the bourgeoisie anyways, as labor conditions had forced children into factories and their parents to work longer hours, preventing the proletariat from forming a traditional bourgeoisie family unit regardless. So the goal of communism was to dissolve all religious institutions, moral institutions, and ideologies that upheld the class conflict that the bourgeoisie system ultimately ended up creating. So what they did was they went on to define the policies of the communist state. And the first was the abolition of private property, especially for the purposes of rents. The second was heavy taxation and income tax. The third was the abolition of inheritance. The fourth, the confiscation of property of all immigrants and rebels. The fifth, centralization of credit to the hands of the state. It was to be an exclusive monopoly on capital, as it was to be held by the state. 6 was centralization of transportation and communication by the means of the state. 7 was the means of production and factories were owned by the state. 8th was equal liability for all labor. 9th was a combination of agriculture and manufacturing and a more equal distribution of the population across the whole country instead of a concentration of individuals inside of cities for the purposes of capitalist exploitation. And the 10th was free education for all children. Not only was the state to be responsible for the education of children, but you have to keep in mind that Marx and Engels believed that the bourgeoisie only educated the proletariat for the purposes of supporting the bourgeoisie movement, and unwittingly ended up supplying the proletariat with the weapons of bourgeoisie demise. So they figured, what the heck, we might as well beat them all to it and just provide free education for absolutely everybody anyways. And then finally, there was the dissolution of the political system. The Marx and Engels argued that with the dissolution of class systems, public power would lose its political character, and that political power was simply one class oppressing another. Now moving on to the third section, socialist and communist literature. The division of socialist communist literature fell into 3 separate categories. The first was reactionary socialism, the second conservative or bourgeoisie socialism, and the third was critical utopian socialism and communism. Now during Marx and Engels' time, reactionary socialism was divided into feudal socialism, petite or petty bourgeoisie socialism, and German or true socialism. Now looking at specifically reactionary socialism, feudal socialism under reactionary socialism, it was a form of socialism where the aristocracy during these feudal times would reach out to the proletariat for the support of existing class conditions due to ongoing threats and pressure from the bourgeoisie. Now you have to keep in mind that the bourgeoisie was formed out of the feudal system, and the bourgeoisie wanted to dismantle the existing aristocratic system. So the aristocracy would reach out to the proletariat, and they would often create this literature of whispers of coming doom and of Armageddon for society as a whole. Now, naturally, looking back on the conditions created by the aristocracy, the proletariat ended up deserting the aristocratic plight. Now, reactionary socialism was petty bourgeoisie socialism. It was a combination of peasant proprietors, shopkeepers, and artisans with a new budding bourgeoisie. This bourgeoisie would take up the plight of the proletariat class. Now, it pointed out issues of class conflict. However, its solution was to restore old means of production. So what they wanted was corporate guilds for manufacturing and patriarchal relations in agriculture. So there's still a class system. It was just made up of a small bourgeoisie supporting the claims and the oppression and the desires of the proletariat movement. Now there's a reactionary socialism under this as well. It was under German or true socialism. This was considered by Marx and Engels to be early socialism at the epoch of its class conflict with the bourgeoisie. It had just begun its class conflict with feudal absolutism. Now, the French literature of the revolution had immediate significance to the German worker, but you have to keep in mind that Marx's primary criticism was that it was only literary, where in France it tended to create a significant revolution and an uprising that resulted in the French Revolution. A lot of Germany at the time, under this true socialism construct, wanted to adopt a French socialist ideology without overthrowing their existing philosophical condition. Now, there were minor changes to the existing philosophical condition, but most of it was nothing more than philosophical fantasy. It failed to represent or identify the class conflict and the struggle of the proletariat at all, and petty bourgeoisie would constantly crop up time and time again and serve as the basis for the so-called true socialism. It was radically opposed to the brutally destructive nature of communism, and it asserted supremacy while being contemptuous of genuine class struggles. Now, moving forward, there was the second major class of conservative or bourgeoisie socialism. It was illustrated as part of the bourgeoisie which wants to redress social grievances of the proletariat. So it was still a bourgeoisie society. They just wanted to touch base on the social grievances of the proletariat. They wanted the advantage of modern social ideologies without the struggles or the dangers, i.e. revolution, resulting from an overthrow of existing social structures. Effectively, the end game is a bourgeoisie without a proletariat. The idea behind this literature was free trade for the benefit of the working class, protective duties for the benefit of the working class, prison reforms for the benefit of the working class, and the bourgeoisie is a bourgeoisie for the benefit of the working class. Now, the final form of socialism was the contrast between critical utopian socialism and communism. Now, when we look within critical utopian socialism, there's often a problem with the proletariat still being in its infancy. That is to say, industrialization as well as class development were actually keeping pace with one another, and it had yet to oppress the proletariat to the degree where the proletariat desired an emancipation from the progress of industrialization. Due to the underdeveloped class struggle, socialists in this status often would believe themselves superior to all class antagonism. As a result, they tend to reject all political and revolutionary actions. Instead, they would prefer these small social experiments that Marx and Engels would argue are doomed to failure anyways in order to pave the way for this new social gospel, which was very ideological but very without action. According to Marx and Engels, the publications created under this socialism, however, do attack all institutions and principles of a class-driven society, which actually proved to be extremely useful as a tool for the education of the slowly forming proletariat under critical utopian socialism. These ideas, however, are strongly utopian. They are not, and this is important, they are not revolutionary in character. Effectively, the critical utopian socialist wants a new Jerusalem, but it's still compelled to the appeal to the purses of the bourgeoisie. Now, this is the last section, which is the position of the communist in relation to the existing opposition parties. Quoting Marx, the communists fight for the attainment of the immediate aims, for the enforcement of the momentary interests of the working class. They also represent and take care of the future of that movement. The communist movement never stops pointing out the class antagonism between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The aim of the communist movement is to fight against the bourgeoisie always. The communists, unlike the previous movements, describe support of the revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. Quoting Marx and Engels again, the communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. And let me emphasize that Marx and Engels were very clear about the forcible overthrow of these social conditions. The entire manifesto finishes off by saying, "Let the ruling classes tremble at the communistic revolution. The proletariats have nothing to lose but their chains. They have the world to win. Working men of all countries unite." Now, I don't know about you, but just going off script here, I can see why something like this would be so tremendously attractive to the youth of today, especially if you feel disenfranchised and you don't have any property and you have nothing to lose and you want to do nothing more than fight the government and you have everything to gain. Really, it's a call to that. And I do see myself how Marx and Engels have formed this theory by examining a historical outlook on what ended up forming out of feudal society, what ended up forming in a capitalist society, and how untethered capitalist societies go on to exploit the working man. Whether or not I agree with Marx and Engels' solution, well, I think history gives us a pretty clear picture of the results of communism, and psychologically placing people in the kind of power to oversee a centralized government is entirely too complex for large masses of individuals, and more importantly, the absolute power given to these individuals oftentimes corrupts the individual in power. Those are my thoughts. Provide your comments below. Please let me know. Like, subscribe, share. Do what you need to with this video. I hope it provided you with the education you were looking for.